The summer air of Sarajevo, June 28, 1914, was heavy with anticipation. Crowds lined the narrow streets, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. His car glided past, cheering citizens, its engine growling against the echo of cobblestones. But hidden among the crowd was a different kind of figure, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, his hand trembling, his mind fixed on a single purpose. The spark he was about to ignite would set the entire world ablaze. 2 shots rang out. A stunned silence gripped the city as the Archduke and his wife, Sophie, slumped motionless in their seats. What seemed at first like a local tragedy would become the match that set off a powder keg carefully packed over decades of rivalry, ambition, and pride. Within weeks, Europe's greatest powers, empires that had stood for centuries, would be locked in a war of unimaginable scale. But to understand how a single assassin's bullet could plunge the world into chaos, we must rewind the clock. We must look not only at the alliances and politics of kings and emperors, but at the deeper currents of culture, geography, and human ambition that had been shaping Europe for generations. Imagine a continent in the early 20th century, alive with energy, innovation, and contradiction. The cobbled streets of Paris hummed with new ideas, philosophy, art, literature, and science pushing human progress into the modern age. In Berlin, factories roared with the thunder of steel and coal, symbols of industrial might. In London, the sun never set on an empire that stretched across the globe, its navy ruling the seas. Meanwhile, Vienna's glittering ballrooms echoed with music, masking an empire slowly rotting from within. This was a world of dazzling progress, yet beneath its brilliance lay dangerous fractures. Old monarchies clung to power as new nations demanded independence. Industrialization brought prosperity, but also fueled competition for colonies and resources. Advances in science brought electricity and medicine, but also deadlier weapons, more efficient ways to kill. Europe was like a machine built for war, humming with potential energy, needing only a trigger. And yet, the leaders of this world, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, King George V of Britain, were bound together not only by treaties, but by blood. Cousins, in-laws, rivals. They dined together in palaces, sent telegrams filled with pleasantries, yet their empires lurched toward confrontation, each fearful of appearing weak, each clinging to dreams of greatness. The assassination in Sarajevo did not create those tensions, it revealed them. The shot that killed Franz Ferdinand was not just the death of a man, but the end of an age of optimism, of belief in inevitable progress, shattered in an instant. What followed was not a swift war of honor, as some had naively expected, but a brutal, grinding conflict that dragged the world into the mud, smoke, and fire of the modern battlefield. This is the story of World War I, not just of trenches and battles, but of the cultures, ambitions, and choices that built the path to catastrophe. A war that redefined humanity, reshaped nations, and left scars that still mark our world today. Europe in the early 20th century was a continent of contrasts, bound together by railways and steamships, yet divided by borders, languages, and ancient rivalries. Its geography shaped not only its culture, but also the tensions that would lead to war. At the heart of it all lay Central Europe, where the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire sat like a fragile mosaic. Dozens of ethnic groups lived within its borders: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, Poles, each with their own languages, traditions, and ambitions. From the icy Alps to the plains of Hungary, it was an empire bound not by unity, but by the brittle glue of imperial authority. Vienna glittered like a jewel of culture, but along its edges, nationalist fires smoldered, waiting for the right moment to erupt. To the east stretched the vast expanse of Russia, an empire of snow-covered forests, endless steppes, and glittering palaces in St. Petersburg. Here, Tsar Nicholas II ruled over millions with a heavy hand, But the empire was cracking beneath the weight of poverty, backwardness, and unrest. The sheer size of Russia was both its strength and its weakness. Armies could be summoned in the millions, yet moving them across such vast distances would prove agonizingly slow. To the west, France carried scars that had never truly healed. Only 4 decades earlier, it had lost the Franco-Prussian War, surrendering the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. Those lands were more than just territory. They were symbols of humiliation, a constant reminder that France's honor demanded revenge. Paris itself was alive with culture, its cafes buzzing with debate, its boulevards lined with art and music. But beneath the laughter and glamour lay a simmering determination. When the chance came, France would take back what was lost. And there was Germany, young, powerful, restless. Only unified in 1871, it had grown into an industrial giant at breathtaking speed. Coal mines, steelworks, railways, and factories made it the engine of Europe. Its universities produced leading scientists and thinkers. Its military stood as the envy of the continent. Yet Germany also felt surrounded, encircled by rivals to the west in France, to the east in Russia, and by the British Empire that ruled the seas. Kaiser Wilhelm II dreamed of carving out a place for Germany under the sun, demanding colonies and influence to match its strength. But ambition and insecurity often walked hand in hand. And looming over it all was Britain, an island empire whose navy ruled the oceans, whose colonies stretched across Africa, Asia, and beyond. The British saw themselves as guardians of balance on the continent, stepping in whenever one power grew too strong. But their rivalry with Germany was intensifying, not just in Africa or Asia, but in the cold waters of the North Sea, where a naval arms race saw dreadnought battleships rise like steel leviathans, each meant to outgun the other. Together, these powers formed a delicate web of alliances and distrust. The geography of Europe, its mountains, rivers, and plains, made it a continent where armies could march swiftly, where borders were never far apart, where a single spark in the Balkans could pull the great empires into conflict. And the Balkans themselves were the powder keg, a region of rugged mountains and fierce national pride, where small nations dreamed of independence and old empires fought to keep control. Serbia, in particular, burned with ambition to unite the Slavic peoples, putting it directly at odds with Austria-Hungary. It was here, in this contested land, that history would find its flashpoint. This was Europe on the eve of war, glittering yet fragile, proud yet fearful, modern yet chained to old grudges. A continent where culture flourished in music halls and universities, while beneath the surface, ancient rivalries and nationalist dreams sharpened like blades. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 may have been the spark, but the fire had been smoldering for decades. The origins of the Great War lay not in one man's pistol, but in the deeper structures of politics, ambition, and fear that had been shaping Europe since the late 19th century. The first of these structures was the alliance system, a tangled web meant to preserve peace, but which ultimately guaranteed catastrophe. In 1871, after Prussia's stunning victory over France, the newly formed German Empire sought security. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck carefully crafted alliances to keep France isolated and prevent a two-front war. He bound Germany to Austria-Hungary in the Dual Alliance of 1879, later joined by Italy to form the Triple Alliance. These treaties promised military support in case of attack, a shield against enemies. But no shield comes without a sword. France, humiliated by its loss to Germany, looked east and found a willing partner in Russia. By 1894, the Franco-Russian alliance was born, linking the vast manpower of the Tsar's empire with French resolve. Britain, for decades maintaining its splendid isolation, eventually shifted as well. Alarmed by Germany's rising navy and ambition, Britain drew closer to France in the Entente Cordiale of 1904, and later to Russia in 1907. By the dawn of the 20th century, Europe stood divided into two armed camps, the Triple Alliance on one side, the Triple Entente on the other. What was meant to secure peace, instead, created a fragile balance where any local crisis threatened to drag the whole continent into war. The second force was the arms race. Industrialization had given nations the ability to produce weapons on a scale never before imagined. Germany and Britain in particular competed fiercely on the seas. In 1906, Britain launched HMS Dreadnought, a battleship so powerful it rendered all hers obsolete. Germany responded in kind, building its own fleet of these steel monsters. Each side saw the other's shipyards as a challenge to its survival. On land, too, the armies swelled, millions of men trained, drilled, and mobilized, ready to march at a moment's notice. Railways stretched like veins across Europe, designed not just for trade, but for war, capable of moving entire divisions in days. The third force was imperial rivalry. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, Europe's great powers competed for colonies and influence. The scramble for Africa had left Britain and France with vast empires, while Germany, late to the colonial game, demanded its share. These contests often led to crises. In Morocco in 1905 and again in 1911, Germany challenged France's claim, and the continent trembled on the edge of war. Each crisis was resolved with diplomacy, but each left deeper scars, more bitterness, more mistrust. And beneath it all, nationalism simmered. In the Balkans, newly independent states like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece dreamed of expanding, uniting their ethnic kin, and throwing off the last shackles of Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian rule. Their ambitions clashed violently with the great empires that sought to control the region. Two Balkan wars in 1912 and 1913 redrew borders and stoked hatred, leaving the region unstable, restless, dangerous. By 1914, Europe was a tinderbox. Alliances tied nations together in knots so that one nation's quarrel could become everyone's war. Armies were vast, weapons terrifying, strategies rigid. National pride demanded strength, while fear of weakness demanded action. Diplomats still spoke of peace, but generals drew up timetables of invasion, carefully measured in hours and days. When Gavrilo Princip fired his shots in Sarajevo, the world stood at the edge of a precipice. Leaders believed they could control events, that alliances and armies would deliver quick victories. Instead, they had built a machine that, once set in motion, could not be stopped. The war to end all wars was about to begin. History is not made by individuals alone, but by 1914, a handful of men stood at the helm of empires that spanned the globe. Their choices, their rivalries, and their failures of imagination would shape the course of a conflict that engulfed the world. At the center was Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, a man both ambitious and insecure. The Kaiser was the grandson of Queen Victoria, cousin to King George V of Britain and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. But blood ties could not mask his volatile personality. Wilhelm dreamed of Germany's greatness, of an empire that would rival Britain's, of fleets that would dominate the seas. He was charismatic, often charming in private, but impulsive in politics, prone to outbursts and reckless decisions. His obsession with military power made him beloved by generals but feared by diplomats. To his allies, he was a leader determined to lift Germany to its rightful place. To his enemies, a dangerous man steering Europe toward chaos. Opposite him stood Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, a ruler of immense lands but fragile will. Nicholas embodied the contradictions of his empire, majestic on the surface, yet brittle underneath. He clung to autocracy, believing in his divine right to rule, even as revolutions stirred in the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. He was a devoted family man, gentle with his wife and children, yet indecisive and ill-suited to lead in crisis. In war councils, he often deferred to his generals, and when he finally took command of Russia's armies himself, the results were catastrophic. In Britain, King George V was more symbolic than political, but his presence mattered deeply. Unlike Wilhelm, George was steady, modest, and dutiful, but the rivalry between his cousin in Berlin and his government in London would strain the bonds of family. Real power, however, rested with Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and later David Lowe. By George, leaders who would guide Britain through the storm, balancing politics at home with the need to fight abroad. France's leader, President Raymond Poincaré, was a man shaped by loss. Born in the province of Lorraine, one of the territories France had surrendered to Germany in 1871, Poincaré embodied the French desire for revenge. He believed that Germany posed an existential threat, and he strengthened ties with Russia to ensure that when the time came, France would not fight alone. Beside him, General Joseph Joffre, calm and unflappable, prepared his armies for the test to come, knowing France's honor was at stake. And then there was Austria-Hungary's Emperor Franz Joseph, an old monarch worn down by decades of rule. He had watched his empire stagger through crises, revolts, and defeats. By 1914, he was in his 80s, a relic of another age. His empire held together more by tradition than strength. Yet in the wake of his nephew Franz Ferdinand's assassination, it was under his name that Austria would send its fateful ultimatum to Serbia, setting the wheels of war in motion. Behind these sovereigns stood the generals, men like Helmut von Moltke, the German chief of staff, who inherited the famed Schlieffen Plan, a blueprint for invading France through Belgium. He believed in swift, decisive strikes, but he carried the burden of knowing that one misstep could doom Germany to a two-front war. In Russia, generals like Alexander Samsonov and Paul von Rennenkampf commanded vast armies, but personal rivalries and poor coordination would lead to disaster at Tannenberg. In Britain, Field Marshal John French and later Douglas Haig would lead the British Expeditionary Force into the trenches of France, their decisions costing thousands of lives in the mud of the Western Front. These were the men who steered the destinies of nations. Some were visionaries, some stubbish, or traditionalists, others overwhelmed by the scale of events. Together, they represented both the pride and the blindness of an age. They believed in quick victories, in the glory of battle, in the power of nations to shape history. But none of them could foresee what was coming. A war so vast, so mechanized, so merciless, that it would break not only armies, but the very idea of what civilization meant. The stage was set, the players chosen. The machinery of alliances, armies, and ambition was in place. And when the first mobilization orders were given, these leaders would find themselves trapped, prisoners of their own decisions, their own pride, their own illusions. The years leading up to World War I were marked by a surge of human creativity, industry, and progress. Cities were lit by electricity, factories thundered with mass production, and art movements like Impressionism, Cubism, and Futurism reshaped the way people saw the world. It was a time when many believed they were standing on the threshold of a golden age. Yet, the very inventions that symbolized progress would soon be turned toward destruction on a scale never before imagined. One of the most monumental achievements of the era was industrial production itself. Never had Europe's factories been so capable of producing steel, coal, chemicals, and weapons. The Industrial Revolution had matured, and its byproduct was a capacity for war unlike anything humanity had ever seen. In Germany's Ruhr Valley, furnaces roared night and day, pouring out steel for cannons and locomotives. In Britain, dockyards built dreadnought battleships in months, their vast hulls gliding into the water like floating fortresses. France and Russia, too, expanded their arms industries, stockpiling rifles, shells, and uniforms in anticipation of conflict. But the war would not only be fought with the weapons of the past. New technologies, still experimental in 1914, would find their brutal debut in the trenches. Machine guns, already deadly in colonial wars, would now be mass deployed, mowing down soldiers by the thousands. Barbed wire, a humble invention meant for ranching cattle in America, would become the cruel fence of no man's land. Poison gas, born from the laboratories of Europe's finest chemists, would seep across the battlefield, burning lungs and blinding eyes. Airplanes, flimsy and untested just a decade earlier, would evolve from reconnaissance tools to weapons, their pilots hailed as knights of the sky. Even the seas would see innovation, submarines prowling beneath the waves, striking without warning, transforming naval warfare forever. Beyond the battlefield, the cultural achievements of the era painted a picture of a world at its peak. Vienna was alive with the music of Strauss and the ideas of Freud. Paris thrived as the capital of art, with Picasso and Matisse redefining beauty itself. In literature, writers like Thomas Mann, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Virginia Woolf explored the depths of the human soul, while poets captured both the hope and dread of modernity. It was an age of opera houses, galleries, and intellectual salons, where the arts celebrated human potential even as nations prepared for destruction. Architecture, too, reflected ambition. In Berlin, neoclassical buildings rose as monuments to German pride. In London and Paris, grand boulevards and monuments celebrated empire and progress. Across Europe, railway stations, cathedrals of steel and glass, symbolized movement, speed, and modern life. They stood as temples of a new age where technology was worshipped as much as tradition. And yet, the irony was stark. The very genius that had brought electricity, vaccines, and airplanes also gave humanity machine guns, shells, and chlorine gas. The factories that once produced locomotives and cars would now turn to tanks and artillery. The minds that painted visions of freedom and progress would soon turn. End to poetry of death and despair, written from the trenches. World War I would not only be a clash of armies, but of achievements, an industrialized slaughter fueled by the ingenuity of humankind. The monuments of this era still stand in our cities, bridges, stations, galleries, and universities, but the greatest and most terrible monument of all would be the war itself, a testament to how progress and destruction can walk hand in hand. When the guns of August roared in 1914, millions of men left their homes believing they would return by Christmas. They carried with them the confidence of an age that still imagined war as a matter of quick campaigns, flags raised in victory, and parades through city streets. But what awaited them was not glory. It was mud, hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Daily life in World War I was defined not by victory marches, but by survival. On the Western Front, soldiers entered a world unlike anything they had ever known. Trenches, stretching for hundreds of miles from the North Sea to Switzerland, became both shelter and prison. Dug into the earth, often waist-deep in mud, these narrow ditches swarmed with rats, lice, and the constant stench of unwashed bodies. Rain turned the ground into foul swamps, and winter froze it into iron. A soldier's boots might rot from weeks in standing water, his skin eaten by trench foot, a disease born of cold and damp. The days blurred together, long stretches of waiting punctuated by sudden terror when the whistles blew and men were ordered over the top. Life under bombardment was relentless. At any moment, a shell could tear through the sky and obliterate everything in its path. Soldiers huddled in dugouts, ears ringing, hearts pounding, counting the seconds between explosions. Sleep was rare, food often meager, morale fragile. Yet amid the horror, a strange routine emerged. Letters from home became lifelines, small comforts that reminded men of the world beyond these. E-wire. Cigarettes, tin mugs of tea, or even a joke shared with comrades helped ease the unbearable weight. For many, survival was not about patriotism, but about enduring the next hour, the next day. Behind the front lines, civilians faced their own battles. In cities across Europe, life was reshaped by rationing, shortages, and the ever-present fear of telegrams bearing bad news. Families sent sons, brothers, and fathers to the front, never knowing if they would return. Women took on new roles, working in factories, driving trams, serving as nurses in hospitals where the wounded arrived in endless streams. They became the backbone of the home front, keeping economies alive and families together, even as grief shadowed their lives. Children, too, were touched by the war. In London, Paris, and Berlin, they collected scrap metal for the war effort, stood in long lines for bread, and grew up with the sound of air raid sirens and distant artillery. In rural areas, farms struggled without their young men, leaving harvests short and hunger common. The war reached into every kitchen, every street, every schoolroom. For those under occupation, daily life carried even heavier burdens. In Belgium and northern France, civilians lived under German control, their resources seized, their movements restricted. In Eastern Europe, entire villages were uprooted as armies advanced and retreated across vast plains, leaving devastation in their wake. Refugees fled by the millions, their lives reduced to what they could carry on their backs. Yet amid the suffering, human resilience shone through. Soldiers carved elaborate dugouts, decorated with photos and makeshift furniture, turning mud walls into a semblance of home. Civilians organized charities, concerts, and relief efforts, determined to maintain a sense of normalcy. Even in the darkest moments, people clung to small rituals. Sile, braiding Christmas, singing songs, sharing food, proof that humanity could endure, even when surrounded by destruction. World War I was not only fought on the front lines, it was lived in kitchens, in fields, in factories, and in trenches. It was carried in the hearts of ordinary people who bore the weight of extraordinary times. The war would test not just armies, but entire societies, reshaping how men and women understood duty, endurance, and sacrifice. The war that leaders promised would be over by Christmas soon revealed its true nature. A conflict not of swift maneuvers and glorious charges, but of attrition, of stalemates measured in yards gained and lives lost. The First World War became a series of colossal struggles, each testing the endurance of nations and the limits of human suffering. The first shock came in 1914 with the German invasion of Belgium. According to the Schlieffen Plan, Germany sought to strike France quickly by sweeping through neutral territory. The invasion brought Britain into the war, and the world soon witnessed the destruction of Belgian towns, the burning of Louvain, and the suffering of civilians caught in the path of armies. German troops surged toward Paris, but at the River Marne in September, French and British forces made a desperate stand. Taxicabs famously ferried soldiers to the front, and when the battle ended, Germany's advance was stopped. The dream of a quick victory had collapsed. The Western Front hardened into trenches, and a new, grimmer phase of war began. By 1915, new horrors unfolded. Poison gas was unleashed at Ypres, green clouds drifting across no man's land, choking and blinding soldiers, heralding an age of chemical warfare. The Allies struck at Gallipoli, hoping to open a route to Russia by seizing the Dardanelles. Instead, they faced fierce Ottoman resistance, led by a young officer named Mustafa Kemal. The beaches became killing grounds, and after months of bloodshed, the Allies withdrew in defeat. Gallipoli became a symbol of courage, futility, and the emergence of national identity for Australians and New Zealanders who fought there. The year 1916 brought the titans of attrition. At Verdun, the German army launched a massive assault on the French fortress city, hoping to bleed France white. For 10 months, waves of men hurled themselves into the furnace of artillery, machine guns, and flame. Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass, became France's rallying cry. When it ended, Verdun had claimed over 700,000 casualties, yet the lines barely moved. That same year, the British launched the Somme offensive. On the first day alone, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, the bloodiest day in their history. For months, the battle dragged on, introducing tanks to the battlefield but delivering little but death. By November, over 1 million men had fallen for gains measured in miles. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war stretched across vast spaces. Russian armies clashed with Germany and Austria-Hungary, sometimes winning, often losing disastrously. At Tannenberg in 1914, an entire Russian army was encircled and destroyed, a humiliation that revealed the empire's weaknesses. Yet the Eastern Front never solidified into trench warfare on the same scale as the West. Armies moved, but the human cost was just as staggering. Beyond Europe, the conflict spread. In the Middle East, the Ottomans joined the Central Powers, fighting the British in Mesopotamia and Palestine. In Africa, colonies became battlegrounds where African soldiers and civilians were drawn into Europe's quarrels. On the seas, German U-boats prowled, sinking merchant ships and threatening to starve Britain into submission. In 1915, the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania, with over 1,000 lives lost, including Americans, shocked the world and began shifting opinion in the United States. By 1917, exhaustion gripped all sides. Revolution shook Russia, pulling the empire out of the war after the Bolsheviks seized power. In the West, mutinies erupted among French soldiers, tired of endless slaughter. And then came America. Angered by submarine warfare and inspired by President Woodrow Wilson's call to make the world safe for democracy, the United States entered the war. Fresh troops, fresh weapons, fresh money. Suddenly, the balance began to tilt. In 1918, Germany launched one last desperate gamble, the Spring Offensive. Using stormtrooper tactics, they smashed through Allied lines, advancing further than they had in years. For a moment, it seemed victory was within their grasp, but the offensive overextended, supply lines faltered, and the Allies counterattacked. With American divisions pouring in, Germany's armies were pushed back. The 100 Days Offensive broke the stalemate. By November, the exhausted Central Powers crumbled. Bulgaria surrendered, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Austria-Hungary fell apart. Germany, starving and broken, faced revolution at home. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The war had claimed over 16 million lives. It had redrawn borders, toppled empires, and left entire generations scarred. But as the soldiers emerged from the trenches, they carried with them not triumph, but a haunted silence. The Great War had ended, but its legacy was only beginning. The year was 1918, and the guns that had thundered across Europe for 4 relentless years finally began to fall silent. But behind that silence was no peace, only exhaustion, ruin, and the shattering of old worlds. The empires that had once carved their banners into continents now stood at the brink of collapse, their centuries-old thrones crumbling into dust. What ended on November 11th was not just a war, it was the death of an age. Germany, once so confident under Kaiser Wilhelm II, faced total collapse. Its people, worn down by hunger, blockade, and military defeat, erupted in strikes and revolution. Soldiers mutinied in the ports of Kiel, refusing to fight a hopeless battle. Workers' councils rose, inspired by the Russian Revolution, demanding change. On November 9, 1918, Wilhelm fled into exile, his empire dissolving overnight. In its place, the Weimar Republic was born, fragile, democratic, and burdened with the scars of war and the weight of resentment. To the east, the mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved like sand slipping through clenched fists. For centuries, Vienna had ruled a patchwork of peoples: Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Poles, Italians, and more. War exposed the fault lines in this fragile mosaic. As the Habsburg crown faltered, nationalist movements surged. Czechoslovakia declared independence. Hungary broke away. South Slavs united into the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. What had been one empire fractured into many, each carrying its own burdens of hope and bitterness. Further east still, the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, finally succumbed to terminal illness. Once rulers of vast lands across 3 continents, the Ottomans staggered out of the war defeated and humiliated. Their Arab provinces, long restless, slipped from their grasp, parceled into British and French mandates. Istanbul, the jewel of the Bosporus, faced Allied occupation. Mustafa Kemal, the soldier later known as Ataturk, would rally his people in a war of independence, transforming the ruins of empire into the modern nation of Turkey. Yet for millions of Armenians, Greeks, and Arabs, the empire's collapse brought not freedom, but displacement, massacre, and exile. And in Russia, the empire had already fallen to fire and revolution. The Romanovs, rulers for 3 centuries, were executed in a basement as Bolshevik forces swept across the land. The old empire of the Tsars was gone, replaced by civil war and the first steps of what would become the Soviet Union. From the frozen snows of Siberia to the streets of Moscow, a new radical experiment in governance was born, one that promised liberation but carried the seeds of authoritarian rule. When the smoke cleared, the map of the world was redrawn. 4 great empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, had collapsed, replaced by fragile republics, fledgling nations, and revolutionary states. Britain and France emerged victorious but bled, their strength eroded even in triumph. The United States, though distant, had entered as a late savior and left as a new world power. The old order of monarchs and empires was gone. In its place stood uncertainty, fragile democracies, and revolutions. The First World War had not only ended lives, it had ended worlds. And the peace that followed, far from bringing stability, would plant the seeds of even greater storms to come. The guns of August fell silent more than a century ago, yet the war's echo still vibrates through our world today. It is a haunting resonance carved into maps, into politics, into memory itself. The legacy of the First World War did not vanish with the armistice. Instead, it sculpted the very foundations of the 20th century and continues to shape the 21st. Consider the borders. The sweeping collapse of empires left political vacuums filled with fragile nations. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved into a patchwork of successor states, from Czechoslovakia to Yugoslavia, each carrying seeds of both national pride and ethnic tension. In the Middle East, the secretive Sykes-Picot Agreement redrew Ottoman lands with artificial lines, giving birth to nations like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. These borders, drawn with little regard for cultural realities, remain flashpoints of conflict to this very day. The war also redefined memory itself. For the first time in history, nations built monuments, not for generals alone, but for the ordinary soldier, the nameless, faceless millions who had perished in muddy trenches. Across France and Belgium, rows of white headstones stretch endlessly, silent witnesses to the scale of the loss. The cenotaph in London, the tomb of the unknown soldier in Paris, and Arlington's memorials in the United States stand as timeless reminders of sacrifice. In villages across Europe, plaques engraved with long lists of names ensured that grief was etched into local life. Culturally, the war shattered illusions of innocence. The optimism of the 19th century, faith in science, industry, and progress, was poisoned by the brutality of mechanized slaughter. Artists and writers, from Wilfred Owen's bitter poetry to Otto Dix's grotesque paintings, captured a world where the old ideals of honor and heroism had withered in the smoke of machine guns. This was the birth of modern cynicism, the turning point where humanity questioned not only its leaders, but the very meaning of civilization. And yet, from the devastation also came transformation. Medicine advanced rapidly. Blood transfusions, antiseptics, reconstructive surgery, and treatments for shell shock all developed under wartime necessity. Aviation leapt from fragile biplanes to an emerging industry that would soon connect continents. Women, having worked in factories and hospitals, demanded recognition, accelerating suffrage movements and altering gender roles forever. But perhaps the most haunting legacy was political. The Treaty of Versailles sought peace but planted seeds of resentment. Germany, humiliated and burdened with crushing reparations, seethed with nationalist anger. Italy, though a victor, felt betrayed, denied promised territories. The Russian Revolution, born amid the chaos, spread new ideological battles across the globe. These aftershocks would erupt into an even greater inferno. The Second World War. Even today, the war whispers in the background of modern conflicts, in the persistence of unresolved ethnic struggles, in the trauma etched into family stories passed through generations. Each November, red poppies bloom on lapels, a fragile flower rising from the soil of Flanders fields, a reminder that from death can come memory, and from memory, lessons. The First World War was more than a conflict of empires. It was the crucible of the modern age. It reshaped how we fight, how we grieve, how we govern, and how we imagine the future. Its shadow is long, its silence deceptive, for beneath it lies the thunder that still shapes our world. The guns of August fell silent long ago, yet their echoes still haunt the modern world. A century has passed since the first shots were fired, and still the shadow of the Great War stretches across history, shaping nations, cultures, and human memory. It was a war meant to be the last, a war that was supposed to end all wars. Instead, it became the template for the century of blood that followed. As we step back and look upon the vast tapestry of World War I, we see not only the battles, the trenches, and the treaties, but also the human heart at its most fragile and its most unyielding. We see young men, barely out of boyhood, staring across muddy battlefields with fear in their eyes and courage in their veins. We see women who rebuilt homes, cared for the wounded, and stepped into roles that transformed societies forever. We see poets and painters who tried to capture the unthinkable, their words and brushstrokes forever marked by the horror of mechanized war. The war was more than geopolitics and borders. It was a rupture in time. The old order of kings, emperors, and aristocracies collapsed, swept aside by the relentless tide of change. The 20th century, its revolutions, its ideologies, its hopes and horrors, was born in the process. Trenches of the Somme and Verdun, in the deserts of Arabia, in the frozen Eastern Front. Out of the fire came nations newly forged, but also wounds that never fully healed. In every corner of the world, memorials stand in quiet dignity. Stone cenotaphs in European town squares, endless fields of crosses in Flanders, plaques carved with names of the fallen in distant colonies. They are not just markers of death. They are reminders of sacrifice, of lives cut short, of futures that never came to be. Each name is a story, each grave a reminder that history is written not only by treaties and speeches, but by blood and loss. And yet, amidst the darkness, there was resilience. Humanity learned, stumbled, and tried to make meaning from the chaos. The League of Nations was born in the war's aftermath, fragile and flawed, but a first attempt at collective security. The voices of the fallen whispered a warning, urging future generations to seek peace, to never repeat the carnage. But history is not so simple, and within 2 decades, the world found itself once again consumed by fire. Today, the legacy of World War I remains etched into our global consciousness. Every border in Europe, every treaty that reshaped the Middle East, every diplomatic tension that lingers has roots in that conflict. But more than that, it taught humanity a lesson that must never be forgotten, that pride, fear, and unchecked ambition can turn nations into graveyards. As we leave the echoes of 1914 to 1918, we are left with a haunting truth. History does not fade. It waits patiently for us to remember. And in remembering, we carry the duty not only to honor the past, but to guard the future. The First World War was the end of one age and the beginning of another. Its silence is not an end, but a warning.